You have probably heard that Russia is on a winter offensive. But the fact that this is happening is more puzzling than it might first seem, and the implications range from weekly good news for Ukraine to something more deeply concerning. Sound complicated? Well, let me explain. Russia's target is Avdiivka, that small city that has managed to hold on for almost a decade, despite being just northeast of Donetsk City. It has been on our radar since the beginning of this phase of the war, and it is shaping up to be this winter's Battle of Bakhmut, with the information war already focused on it. Russia concentrating on the favorably shifting lines on maps, and Ukraine focusing on Russia's high casualty count, and the fact that the city still holds. Zelensky even posted a video greeting at the end of 2023 from just outside of the city, and visited the soldiers and medical support staff that have been fighting the battle. Suffice it to say that Avdiivka will be in your media feeds for the foreseeable future. However, the geographic target is less interesting than the timing. Commentators often point out the upcoming Russian presidential election as the reason, with Putin ostensibly wanting to deliver a big win before Russians go to the polls. But this either simplifies or fundamentally misunderstands the key political dynamics at play. That is why today, we are going to cover the baseline incentives of such elections in autocratic countries. Why, given the current state of affairs, that now is an odd time for an offensive, at least given the publicly known information. And then 5 explanations for why Russia is on the offensive anyway. That this is just another mistake, that Putin is in a weaker position than it appears, that Putin is in a stronger position than it appears, and yes, I am aware how strange it is that the opposite positions can imply the same thing, that the Kremlin needs a test run for the public's tolerance for a long war, and that there is a window of military opportunity that renders the political risks unimportant. We begin with the risks of running elections in autocratic states. Voting in autocracies can look very similar to voting in democracies. You may have to show your identification to get in. Gotta be careful, of course, that it is actually you and not a body double. You may have to wait while they verify the registration that you give. Then you need to sign your name, and eventually you will have to drop off your ballot. Heck, if you vote often enough, you may start to get to know your local poll workers. Their dedication is commendable. But when you control the media, choose opposition candidates, can disqualify others at will, and do the actual vote counting, an autocrat's main concern is not losing the election, so much as losing what happens after the election. Broadly speaking, an autocrat's control of power is constrained by popular uprisings and coups. It is the former category that matters more regarding elections. Fabricated electoral results that do not come close to the underlying preferences of the population risk serving as a rallying call for people to take to the streets. Recent examples of this include Ukraine's Orange Revolution from 2004, Iran in 2009, Bolivia in 2019, Belarus in 2020, and, notably, Russia in 2011. In semi-institutionalized settings like Russia, it is precarious to get out of running the election without making a potential problem worse. So even if you see some potential problems coming, you may have to go along with the process. But you do have some level of control of what the political situation looks like at the time of the election. And that takes us to the strange timing of Russia's offensive. Right now, if the election were held today, Putin seems pretty safe given the publicly available information out there. I want to emphasize the publicly part because that will matter for later. For a temporal comparison, this appears to not be the situation from 2018, when Putin attempted to make pension reforms, which in turn led to large-scale protests on the streets of Moscow. We seem to not even be in the situation from September 2022, when Putin's approval rating took a brief hit during the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of conscripts. It is a small number of families protesting and security forces quickly ending those protests. Basically, if nothing happens between now and March, the probability that Putin survives the election without issue appears to be way over here. But something is happening, of course: the assault on Avdiivka. The broad reason why Russia is doing this is straightforward. Following Ukraine's inability to do much over 2023, Russia thinks that it can extend its gains, perhaps to cover the entirety of the 4 oblasts that became part of the Federation, according to Russian law, in 2022, and maybe go even further. Whether Russia will be successful in such a pursuit remains to be seen. But again, the weird thing here is the timing. Every battle is a gamble, and the more you wager, the more you can lose. It appears that Russia is indeed wagering quite a bit on this one, and Western sources put the Russian casualty figures quite high. Insert the standard incentives to misrepresent caveat here. For broader context, UK intelligence puts daily Russian casualties at 300 higher in 2023 than in the previous year. That might sound surprising given Russia's missteps during the Battle of Kyiv. However, this is a combination of the Battle of Bakhmut at the beginning of the year, the aforementioned mobilization that brought in lower quality soldiers who were easier targets, prison recruiting that brought in even lower quality soldiers, and, of course, Avdiivka. How this ultimately plays out over the next couple of months will change Putin's chances of clearing the March election without issue. The problem here for Putin, using that word loosely in this context, with starting in such an advantageous position way over on the right, is that it is really hard to inch it higher, even if things are going extremely well on the battlefield for Russia. However, it is much easier by comparison for things to turn south. Some example numbers will help clarify the problem. Imagine that Putin is currently sitting at a 98% chance to make it through the election without having any issues. Further, suppose that the Avdiivka offensive is a militarily wise thing to do. It will succeed 60% of the time at a relatively low final cost, and only 40% of the time will it end in disaster. The problem here is that success can only push Putin up to a 100% chance of a stress-free election. Subtle enough that I felt compelled to change the color of the bar just to draw your attention to it, recalling the 98% baseline from doing nothing. Consider what even a modest 8% falloff from failure does for Putin. It is a 60% chance at a 100% chance of survival, and a 40% chance at a 90% chance of survival. Multiply those out, then add them together, and you get 96%. Still looking good for Putin, but not quite as good as the baseline was by maintaining the status quo. And thus, despite an offensive being a good military strategy, you may get no escalation if Putin's only real interest is his own safety. Political scientists normally call the result of this incentive structure peace through instability, but perhaps lack of escalation through instability would be a little more precise for the current situation. So again, asking why Russia is on the offensive should not be the question. It is why do it now, 2 months before the election, when you could wait until afterward, and as an extra bonus, not have to deal with the winter weather that might freeze your offensive. One possibility is that Russia is just off doing weird things yet again. Following Russia's miscalculation at the start of the war, the Western public narrative became that the Russian Ministry of Defense had no idea how to fight a war. However, the reality seems to be far duller than that. Bad intelligence led to some significant missteps with the Kyiv offensive at the start of the war, both regarding Ukraine and the discipline of Russia's own soldiers. That, combined with the corruption issues that plagued Russia's military hardware and caused things to explode that were definitely not supposed to, is what allowed Kyiv to hold on during the war's initial phase. However, Russia corrected its slight miscalculation problem regarding Ukraine's resolve within a month, but the reverberations from that mistake, along with the much longer time needed to rectify problems with equipment and corruption, gave Ukraine the ability to fight back well beyond its own capacity. But since then, Russia has made better decisions, including the pivotal retreat from Kherson in November 2022, which bought the Russian army enough time to build a defensive line and resist Ukraine's 2023 offensive. Though how much influence the architect of that strategy still has is opaque, following an apparent scandal involving Wagner. Even so, until there is evidence of further poor Russian planning, it is best to cross off silly mistakes from the list. A genuine miscalculation given other complicated factors is more reasonable, but such a possibility needs to be put in the context of the other motivations. And the first serious possibility is a stronger Kremlin position. This logic is straightforward given the example math from a moment ago. Before, we imagined an 8% deduction in Putin's survival rate, given a resounding failure in Avdiivka. But suppose instead that Russia's internal security forces are better than that. Wherever a protest problem might arise, they will quash it before it becomes significant. Or, alternatively, the Kremlin has even tighter control over the domestic information drip, so that the vast majority of Russians will never learn about any bad outcomes in Avdiivka. If so, then that 8% downside risk might be a much more modest 2%. Pulling up and revising the numbers from earlier, we get a 98.4% chance of survival, which edges out the default chances. Basically, because the downside risk is frozen near the status quo, the gamble becomes favorable. Interestingly, hidden Kremlin weakness can also explain the decision. The idea here is that prospects for the election under the status quo do not look as attractive as it might seem. So instead of starting out here, maybe Putin's default survival chances are significantly lower. Perhaps the Kremlin believes that sentiments are quietly starting to reach a boiling point, even if we have not yet seen the consequences of that. There is some evidence that the war is becoming a more sensitive topic within the country. Putin's New Year's address, seen here in all of its out-of-focus glory, only contained vague references to the military, and not what was actually happening in Ukraine. That is in stark contrast with the prior year's address, as the background for that speech makes obvious. There is also the interesting conspiracy theory that when critical statements appeared behind Putin during his annual live call-in show, none of them directly addressed the war, and thus, per the theory, they were planted to give the veneer of greater political openness in Russia, while simultaneously avoiding a third rail. Alternatively, maybe there are concerns in the Kremlin that Ukraine's actions on the opposite side of the Dnipro River in Kherson will snowball in the next couple of months, creating another narrative that the Kremlin is once again not in control of the conflict. To be clear, this battle is a bit of a puzzle. Some of the recent indications suggest that Ukraine may be hitting a wall there, or maybe the blue and yellow soldiers are doing great. Who knows? Those headlines were literally a day apart. The information war seems to be accelerating right now. Buckle up. In any case, using the numbers from before, this is like saying that the baseline expectation is not 98%, but something smaller, say 75%. The probability of safety following a failure in Avdiivka still drops. But the key thing here is what happens following a success. 100% is a hard cap, much as my own animations are trying to mock me right now. Come on, get back there. Thank you. The upper bound in the modified case is much harder to press up against. Starting at 75%, a 20-point gain is not unreasonable. This puts the numbers in favor of Putin taking a gamble on Avdiivka. To see what's changed, let's bring back the original numbers. Back then, fighting in Avdiivka gave him a 96% chance of survival, which was not as good as his 98% chance if he just stayed out. Dropping to a 75% baseline for staying out, while still maintaining the 8% further loss from a failure, but bumping up to a 20% gain from a success, means that you clearly should go into this battle. The next possibility is that this is a trial run. Thus far, we have been thinking about these survival rates as a snapshot in time. However, in practice, Putin must also worry about political survival after the election as well. Rewinding a moment, Recall the rhetoric coming out of the Kremlin indicating that Russia had intentions to occupy the totality of the 4 claimed oblasts, and perhaps go even further. Nonetheless, despite Ukraine's well-documented recent struggles on the offensive, Russia has experienced its own problems trying to take territory since the opening months of the war. Bakhmut is the notable exception, of course, but that came at an enormous cost. Moreover, the driving force behind that offensive is not exactly still around. The point is that if the Kremlin wants to expand out to here, the loss of Russian life necessary to do so is going to be enormous. From this perspective, the Kremlin is using Avdiivka as a trial balloon. Suppose that stability following the election will be high no matter what happens on the battlefield. I'm talking about putting those numbers in the deepest of deep freezes. But the vote count still gives authentic feedback to the Kremlin about whether the Russian population will tolerate the long-run costs of further offensives, or if popularity like this could be fleeting. This is a subtle point. Survival rates and vote counts are not the same thing. Are they correlated? Yes. But even low votes can still yield high survival rates, given public beliefs about the strength of security forces, and meta-beliefs about whether others will join them to protest. In fact, the meta part is why the official tallies will be high, even if they are not truly so. That manipulation aside, if the real vote count drops enough, the Kremlin will internalize the warning and not take further actions that will inflame the Russian public. That, in turn, ensures that the future government stability remains at acceptably high levels. But if vote tallies remain high, then it is a sign that the Kremlin can control the domestic narrative, and it will be a green light for future offensives. This is one explanation for why autocratic governments run elections more generally, something that I will cover in greater depth soon, just waiting to get closer to the election. For now, suffice it to say that the executive is not paying attention to the public part of the election, just the private figures. Even if the publicly released vote counts will say that the incumbent won by an absolutely sweeping margin, the government itself has access to the raw vote counts, and it can use that information to change policies and avoid future instability. Or, as Moscow would hope in this case, can confirm that further force is fine. The final possibility is a window of opportunity for Russia. This takes the reality that the offensive is indeed a bad idea in terms of Kremlin stability as a given, and instead points to another incentive that trumps it. Here, an opportunity to close out the war. Right now, when it comes to Western aid, it feels like Ukraine is on the ropes. NATO countries spent 2023 passing the buck to one another when it came to arming Kyiv. Meanwhile, funding in Washington is stalled until congressional Republicans sort out their own disagreements. This is not where you want to be as a boxer. If Russia can deliver a devastating blow, then perhaps the aid will forever come to an end. Afterward, Russia will have an easier time pushing around Ukraine further, which then justifies the extra domestic risk now to the Kremlin. And if you wait until the election passes, the window may already be closed. So it is now or never for Russia. And there is always the concern that waiting for winter to end will just trade the problem of the cold with the problem of defrosting mud, which would delay exploiting the window of opportunity even longer. Either way, this would incentivize Russia to press on now. So which explanation is driving the Kremlin's behavior? As is often the case, we do not really know the answer to that as outside observers. I would be cautious in even wagering that Western intelligence organizations know either. The picture may even be blurry for the Kremlin. And that is where the risk of backfire is for Putin. If this was supposed to be a test run, because the Kremlin believed that the numbers were frozen solid, but that assessment is wrong, then Putin may regret the Avdiivka gamble. This is not just an issue for the test run mechanism either. Rolling the dice could go poorly if Russia's assessments are wrong on other fronts, including the relative probabilities of success and failure at Avdiivka. I suppose it is a question for the comments about which explanation you think is driving the Kremlin's risky behavior. Meanwhile, you can take a risk by picking up a copy of my new book on the strategy of Russia's invasion. The good news here is that if the risk backfires, you will not be facing your own personal revolution. At least I don't think so. Let me know otherwise, or then again, maybe not because you'll be gone. Alternatively, you can check out the OG lines on maps. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.